The defeat at Cannae had shaken Rome to its very core. The Senate, once the confident ruler of a mighty empire, was now gripped by panic. Hannibal, like a predatory beast, tore through the Italian landscape, his victories sowing fear and despair. Yet, despite their losses, the Romans did not break. A profound sense of patriotism, coupled with an iron will to win, compelled them to mobilize all their strength for the struggle. Their strategy shifted. Direct confrontations with the Carthaginian army became less desirable. The Romans focused on wearing down the enemy, avoiding major battles, and gradually reclaiming lost territories. The Fabian strategy, a series of smaller skirmishes, attrition warfare, and the avoidance of decisive battles, once again became the cornerstone of Roman military doctrine. Hannibal, aware of the difficulties of completely subjugating Italy, hoped for a rebellion of the Italian tribes against Rome. He achieved some success. Several tribes, exhausted by Roman expansion and tempted by promises of freedom, switched sides to the Carthaginians. However, a full-scale uprising never materialized. The Roman Senate, unlike during previous crises, demonstrated remarkable unity. They understood that the conquest of Italy was merely the first stage of Hannibal's strategy. His true objective was Rome itself. Understanding this, the Romans began strengthening their positions in southern Italy, building new fortresses and fortifying existing ones. Hannibal, unable to storm well-defended cities, was forced to move from one city to another, wearing down his army in endless sieges. Constant raids by Roman legions prevented him from receiving much-needed supplies and reinforcements from Africa. With each passing day, the Carthaginian army grew weaker, morale plummeted, and the supply of food and weapons became increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, in Rome, a new leader emerged, Scipio Africanus. This young but talented commander, a product of the Fabian strategy, was distinguished not only by his exceptional military abilities but also by his decisiveness and courage. He managed to unite the Roman legions, inspire them to fight anew, and develop a strategy to counter Hannibal. Scipio understood that victory in Italy was impossible without attacking Carthage itself. He proposed a bold idea: transporting troops to Africa and waging war on enemy soil. This idea initially met resistance in the Senate. Many senators feared leaving Italy undefended. But Scipio, confident in his vision, persuaded them to see the potential of his plan. He promised to lure Hannibal out of Italy, forcing him to return home to defend his native Carthage. Finally, the Senate agreed, and Scipio received the necessary resources for a large-scale expedition to Africa. The landing of a massive invasion force in Africa took the Carthaginians by surprise. Hannibal, after years of war in Italy, suddenly found himself needing to fight on his own land. He was forced to abandon Italy, leaving his renowned army behind, and march to meet Scipio. The war was approaching its climax. The clash between two brilliant commanders, Scipio and Hannibal, promised to be a spectacle that would forever be etched in the annals of military history. The fate of Rome and Carthage would be decided in this grand duel. The winter winds that swept across the Alps carried not only cold but also rumors of a Roman legion, exhausted by a long march and lack of provisions, replenishing its ranks with local tribes to muster strength for a decisive battle. Hannibal, observing this slow but relentless advance of the enemy from the heights, felt not only the cold but also a faint, yet undeniable, tremor in his soul. The victory at Cannae, which had shattered Rome's pride into 1,000 pieces, now seemed a distant memory, overshadowed by setbacks and exhaustion. The Carthaginian army, once mighty and invincible, was now but a shadow of its former glory. Iberian allies, initially filled with enthusiasm, began to gradually retreat, fearing Roman retribution. Tension mounted with each passing day. Hannibal, wrapped in his toga, watched his battle-hardened but famine and disease-weakened soldiers perform their duties. He remembered the heroism of his elephants, who had once broken through the ranks of Roman legionaries, but now only a few remained, exhausted and sick. Their once formidable glory was now eclipsed by their current weakness. The Romans, taught by the bitter experience of previous defeats, acted cautiously. They did not rush into open battle, attempting to wear down the Carthaginians through starvation and maneuverability. Fabius Maximus, the same Fabius who had once exhausted Hannibal with his strategy of protracted war, now advised the commanders of the Roman army, imparting his experience in attrition warfare. Hannibal understood that time was working against him. He could not indefinitely hold his positions, waiting for uncertain aid from Carthage. He was forced to take a risk. He gathered his commanders for a war council under the starry sky. The air was thick with tension, as before a storm. Hannibal, his deep gaze piercing each person present, laid out his plan. It was a risky gamble, a game on the edge of possibility, but it was his last chance. He decided to attack the Roman camp, using the element of surprise. Night would be his ally. Under the cover of darkness, the Carthaginian army would sneak into the enemy camp and launch a surprise attack. It was a plan fraught with risk, but Hannibal saw no other way. The battle that began under the dark sky was fierce and bloody. The Carthaginians, though exhausted, fought with desperate courage, trying to break through the Roman defenses. However, the Romans, mindful of their past experiences, were prepared for a night attack. They repelled the assault, inflicting significant losses on the Carthaginians. Hannibal, observing the course of the battle, realized that his plan had failed. He was forced to retreat, leaving many of his soldiers on the battlefield. This was his last attempt. His dream of defeating Rome was fading, buried under the weight of exhaustion, continuous defeats, and insufficient support. He saw that his heroic epic was ending. With tears in his eyes, he gave the final order to his exhausted soldiers, thinking only of a dignified retreat to preserve at least the core of his army and return home. Victory over Rome was now impossible. His legend, written in blood and fire, was slowly but inevitably reaching its tragic end. A strong wind drove clouds over the Apennines, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and smoke from fires. The uprising in Capua, unexpected and brutal, dealt a final blow to the Romans, who were already exhausted by the prolonged war. Hannibal, observing the burning city from a hilltop, felt mixed emotions. The victory was sweet, but its taste was bitter because of the price paid. His army, once mighty and unwavering, was now halved, and supplies were on the verge of depletion. The loyal Iberians and Gauls, who had once followed him without hesitation, were now weary and demoralized. The Romans, despite their losses, did not falter. Their spirit, unbreakable like the marble of their statues, found new strength in anger and despair. Fabius Maximus, the old fox famed for his strategy of protracted war, once again led the Roman forces. He understood that a direct confrontation with Hannibal was suicide. Instead, he launched a policy of attrition, avoiding open battles and destroying all Carthaginian supply lines. Hannibal, accustomed to brilliant victories, could not understand this approach. He was used to decisive actions, to quick results. This slow, debilitating war was alien to him, as it undermined his army from within, turning his soldiers into a pack of hungry wolves capable of any crime. Desertion increased. The Gauls, who had initially joined Hannibal for profit, became easier to lure to the Roman side with promises of amnesty and land. Hannibal tried to maintain discipline, but his once unshakable authority began to weaken. News from Carthage was not very encouraging. The Council of Elders was divided. Some demanded an immediate end to the war, others, a continuation of the struggle, but with less enthusiasm. In addition, Rome managed to mobilize new legions, replenishing its ranks with fresh and well-armed soldiers. Rome did not break, on the contrary, it only strengthened. Desperately seeking a way out, Hannibal decided to take a risk. He knew that Carthage could no longer provide him with significant assistance. He decided on a desperate attack on Rome itself. He went through numerous traps set by Roman troops, but reached the approaches to the city. Before his eyes rose the high walls of the Eternal City, which seemed an insurmountable fortress. A battle near Rome was inevitable. However, Fabius Maximus, hearing of Hannibal's approach, was in no hurry to fight. He employed his strategy of siege, blocking the approaches to the city and further exhausting Hannibal's army. He made it clear that Rome would not be easily taken and that Hannibal would have to pay a high price. The tension grew. Days turned into an endless struggle for survival. Hannibal understood that the chances of victory were melting like snow under the spring sun. His loyal soldiers, exhausted and hungry, were losing faith in victory. Hannibal's spirit, once filled with strength and determination, was now weakened. He stood on the verge of defeat, gazing at the imposing city he could not conquer. Ahead of him was a difficult choice: retreat or a suicidal attack that could no longer lead to victory. The fate of the great Hannibal hung by a thread. The war was not yet over, but the shadow of defeat already fell upon Carthage. The winter of 216 BC was harsh. The snow that covered the fields around Cannae froze on every wrinkle of the faces of the Roman prisoners of war, who stood, shackled, under the fierce Roman sun. Hannibal's victory was stunning, catastrophic for Rome. The two consuls, Paulus and Varro, lay dead on the battlefield, and the army, once mighty and invincible, was shattered. Rome, struck by the blow, trembled with fear of Carthaginian might. The Senate, filled with panic, literally drowned in discussions. Some called for peace, others, with a last desperate hope, for a continuation of the struggle. Fabius Maximus, the old strategist whose cautious tactics had once saved Rome from complete defeat, now came forward with a simple but crucial proposal: the exhaustion of the enemy. He warned against major battles, proposing a tactic of guerrilla warfare, burning fields, destroying communication routes, and creating constant chaos for Hannibal's army. His words were like the voice of reason in a kingdom of madness, but many still remembered the criticism that had been heaped upon him earlier for his overly cautious strategy. Therefore, his plan was only partially accepted. The Roman Republic mobilized all its resources. All men of fighting age were called up for military service, even slaves received a chance at freedom in exchange for service. New legions, though not as experienced as their predecessors, were urgently trained and equipped. Money flowed like a river to supply the army and maintain the loyalty of allies, who, struck by the scale of the defeat, began to hesitate. Few of them intended to refuse support to Rome, but doubt was clearly felt. Hannibal, meanwhile, was in no hurry. He understood that Rome, though defeated, was not broken. His army, although victorious at Cannae, had suffered significant losses. Southern Italy, though under Carthaginian control, was not completely subjugated. Constant skirmishes with partisan detachments, attacking from behind every hill, were exhausting his troops. The Romans, following Fabius's advice, avoided open battles, instead delivering swift, painful blows and disappearing into the shadows. Hannibal hoped that the Romans would offer peace on his terms. He sought not so much to destroy Rome as to force it to acknowledge Carthage's superiority in the Mediterranean. But Rome, even at its worst hour, did not intend to surrender. Pride and the desire to restore glory were strong motivators. In the spring of 215 BC, Hannibal moved north, attempting to subjugate Gaul and gain the support of local tribes. He hoped for significant assistance, but disappointment awaited him. The Gauls, though impressed by the might of the Carthaginian army, were in no hurry to become his loyal allies. Treachery, intrigue, and constant doubts torpedoed his plans. The campaign proved exhausting and did not yield the desired results. Hannibal's return to Italy was triumphant only outwardly. He won several minor victories, but lost many soldiers, and the army's morale was shaken. The Romans learned from their mistakes. They improved their defensive strategy and began to deliver more effective blows to Hannibal's supply lines, limiting his ability to maneuver. The war of attrition began to work in Rome's favor. The long struggle continued, and its end was still far off, but hope for victory returned to the hearts of the Romans. A winter storm raged over the Alps, covering the last traces of the Carthaginian army with snow. Hannibal, his face scarred by frost and fatigue, watched as his exhausted soldiers tried to light fires, using wet branches and frozen grass. The victory at Cannae seemed a lifetime ago, a luxurious dream from which he had been brutally awakened by harsh reality. The Romans, unbroken, undefeated, not even bewildered, were rebuilding their legions. Fabius's strategy of avoiding open battles and wearing down the enemy was becoming increasingly effective. Hannibal understood, he could not crush Rome with one blow, as he had hoped. Now he faced a protracted, exhausting war. The defeat at Cannae affected not only the morale of the Romans. It also shook their political system. The popular assembly buzzed with demands for revenge and immediate decisive action. But the Senate, wiser than the crowd, understood that a direct confrontation with Hannibal should be avoided. Other methods were needed. Therefore, despite losses, Rome constantly increased its troops, using all its resources. Gaul, Spain, even Sicily, legions arrived from everywhere, although not as experienced as those who perished at Cannae. Hannibal had to constantly maneuver, avoiding major battles, surviving through looting and diplomacy. He hoped for the support of his allies, but they hesitated, seeing Rome's unyielding nature. Slowly but surely, Rome was restoring its positions. Scipio Africanus, a young and ambitious commander, began to successfully operate in Spain, gradually pushing the Carthaginians away from the Iberian lands. This was a blow in the back to Hannibal, because Spain was the main source of his supplies. As spring approached, the situation became increasingly critical for the Carthaginian army. There was little food, morale was falling. Winter losses were significant. Hannibal, accustomed to victories, was now forced to wage guerrilla warfare, relying on quick raids and small victories. His glory, which had once shone brighter than the sun, now began to dim under the weight of circumstances. He knew that it could not last long. A major battle was needed, but not one like Cannae. Now, weakened, he could not afford mistakes. He observed the Romans, studied their tactics, trying to find a weak point. But the Romans, taught by bitter experience, were cautious, avoiding traps. One evening, examining a map of Italy, he saw it, a small but important fortress that controlled an important trade route. Capturing this point could significantly worsen the situation for the Romans, giving him a new breathing space. But the risk was great. The Romans would certainly send reinforcements. Hannibal weighed all the pros and cons, and, having made a decision, gave the order. At night, under the cover of darkness and a frosty wind, Hannibal's weakened but still dangerous army set out to storm the fortress. He hoped that this risky operation would be the last straw that would turn the tide of the war, although he understood that it could become his last game. Meanwhile, in Rome, in the cold marble palace, Scipio Africanus patiently awaited his turn. His time was approaching. The remnants of the Carthaginian army, routed at Zama, retreated south, to the shores of Africa. Hannibal, whose face once radiated unwavering confidence, was now contorted with fatigue and despair. For 20 years he waged war against Rome. The victories at Cannae and Trebia now seemed like a ghost of the past. Scipio Africanus, his young but already experienced enemy, proved to be a worthy opponent who deciphered his strategies and ruthlessly shattered them. The defeat at Zama was the last straw. The exhausted soldiers, once the pride of Carthage, were now shadows of their former selves, their armor rusted, their swords dulled, and their faith in victory faded. The return to Carthage was tragic. The city, once proud of its power and wealth, was now gripped by fear and uncertainty. The people, who had once believed in the invincible Hannibal, now whispered of betrayal and failure. The Senate, split between those who sought peace and those who still hoped for a miracle, could not find a single solution. Hannibal, feeling the burden of responsibility for the defeat, tried to reassure the people, but his words no longer sounded as convincing as before. His authority had shaken, and faith in his strategic genius began to melt away. Scipio, realizing the importance of the final defeat of Carthage, was in no hurry. He understood that the victory at Zama was not the end of the war. Carthage needed to be destroyed once and for all so that Rome would never again face such a threat. He carefully planned his next actions, strengthening his fleet and army, preparing for the final battle. He knew that Hannibal, despite his defeats, still posed a danger. His cunning mind and military talent could still be useful for Carthage in its struggle for survival. Meanwhile, Rome celebrated its victory. Scipio was greeted as a hero who had defeated Hannibal himself. But the joy was mixed with caution. Everyone understood that Carthage, though weakened, could still resist. The Senate ordered Scipio to continue the war until the complete destruction of Carthage. There was no room for mistakes, no room for mercy. Scipio began the siege of Carthage. The city was well fortified, its walls were high and strong, but the Romans had a numerical advantage and significantly better organization. The siege lasted for months, protracted battles exhausted both sides. Hunger and disease mowed down the Carthaginians, but they did not surrender. Hannibal, using his experience, organized the defense, but his resources were dwindling. Finally, after a long and bloody siege, the walls of Carthage fell. The Romans stormed the city, drowning in blood and fire. Hannibal, realizing that everything was over, committed suicide to avoid being captured by the enemy. The death of Hannibal Barca marked the end of the Second Punic War. Carthage was destroyed, its glory and might became mere memories. Rome, having exhausted itself in this long and brutal war, established its undisputed hegemony in the Mediterranean. Thousands of lives were lost, but Rome achieved its goal. Carthage ceased to exist, and the Roman Republic became the invincible power of that time. However, the price of this victory was high, a price that was long remembered in Rome as a bitter reminder of the cruelty of war and the cost of imperial ambitions. A grim Roman legionary, Fabius, gripped the hilt of his gladius. Before him lay a valley shrouded in fog, almost concealing the movement of the Carthaginian army. The air was heavy with anticipation, with the smell of dampness and blood that had soaked into the earth after the last skirmish. The Battle of Cannae still stood before his eyes, a horrifying picture of mutilated bodies and a routed army. This time, after the disgrace of Cannae, Rome prepared differently. The strategy of Fabius Maximus, delay, was finally beginning to bear fruit. Hannibal, despite brilliant victories, could not definitively crush Rome. His army, though superior in skill, was exhausted, deprived of reinforcements, and far from home. The war dragged on, turning into an exhausting game of endurance. Hannibal, sitting on his horse, watched the Roman legions tensely holding their defenses. His war-worn face was calm, but a fiery spark burned in his eyes. He understood that time was working against him. With each passing day, support from Carthage weakened, and the Romans, despite their losses, constantly replenished their ranks. The slow but debilitating war wore down the Carthaginians, causing them to starve and fall ill. Even his loyal Numidians, once invincible horsemen, began to feel the weight of the protracted war. The following months were a test of strength for both sides. The Romans, taught by the bitter experience of Cannae, avoided major battles, using the tactics of delay. They controlled supplies, disrupted Hannibal's supply lines, and blocked his maneuvers. Hannibal, in turn, tried to find weaknesses in the Roman defenses, using his unsurpassed mastery of tactics, conducting numerous raids and sieges. He captured cities, exhausting Rome's resources, but could not deliver a final blow. Once, during one of the raids, Hannibal encountered an unexpected problem. The Romans, using scorched earth tactics, burned all the fields around his location. The army was forced to starve, and even his loyal Numidians, accustomed to poverty, began to suffer from lack of food. Eventually, Hannibal had to retreat. This was a minor victory, but it raised the morale of the Romans. After this, Hannibal, realizing that his situation was becoming hopeless, tried to enter into negotiations with Rome. However, the Romans, enraged by decades of war, rejected all his proposals. They sought not just peace, but the complete destruction of Carthage, revenge for all the suffering inflicted by Hannibal. A feeling of hopelessness began to envelop Hannibal. He saw his army slowly but surely melting away. His plans, once brilliant and unsurpassed, now seemed powerless against Rome's perseverance. He understood that even his genius could not overcome the will to live of an entire nation. Soon the moment came when he was forced to accept the inevitable, the slow but inevitable end of the brilliant career of the great commander. As the sun set over the gloomy hills, it slowly disappeared, leaving behind a cold, merciless darkness, a darkness that symbolized the end of one of the most outstanding periods in military history, the end of the era of Hannibal Barca. Rome's victory was not yet final, but the direction of the war was already obvious. A new stage was dawning, a time of restoration and rebuilding, a time when Rome was preparing for new challenges awaiting it on its path to a world empire. But the shadow of the great Hannibal would long lie on the pages of history, reminding us of his brilliant genius and tragic end.